He looked me straight in the eyes, calm as you like, barely even raising his voice, and said I'd never built anything that lasted. 77 years on this earth, 41 years behind an engineering desk, bridges across half of rural Victoria still standing tall while I'm sitting here. And that man, my own son-in-law, said that to my face across a Sunday dinner table like it was nothing more than passing the salt. I didn't shout. I didn't slam my fist down. I just set my knife and fork beside the plate, thanked everyone for a lovely meal, wished them a good evening, and walked out the door. And the worst part, the part that kept me awake for 2 nights straight, wasn't even what Daniel said. It was the silence that followed it. Helen didn't say a word, not one word, and maybe that hurt more than anything else. My name is Graham Whitmore. I'm 77 years old, retired now for going on 12 years, and I live alone in a Federation-style house on Mackenzie Street, here in Bendigo, Victoria. A house I've lived in for longer than most people I know have been alive. My wife Margaret passed several years ago, and since then it's been just me, the workshop out back, and the kind of quiet that settles into a house when the person who used to fill it with warmth is no longer there to do so. I want to tell you about one particular Sunday, and what came after it, because what came after it changed something in me, cracked open a door I hadn't even known was shut. And I think maybe it's the kind of story worth telling. But to understand any of it properly, you need to understand who I was before that dinner, before that sentence, before the silence. You need to understand what I actually built. I grew up in Castlemaine, about 40 minutes south of Bendigo down the Calder Highway. My father was a fitter and turner at the Castlemaine foundry, a quiet, methodical man who believed that a thing worth doing was worth doing with your whole attention. He wasn't much for speeches. He'd come home in the evenings with grease on his forearms and sit in his chair by the window reading engineering manuals the way other men read novels, and if I sat beside him and asked questions, he'd answer every single one without making me feel like a nuisance. That's the best thing a father can do for a boy, I reckon. Make him feel like his curiosity is welcome. By the time I finished secondary school, I knew exactly what I wanted to study: civil engineering at the University of Melbourne. I was 20 when I enrolled, 24 when I graduated, and 25 when I joined the Country Roads Board of Victoria as a junior structural engineer. That was 1973. Victoria was still in the middle of a long push to improve rural infrastructure, roads, culverts, overpasses, and especially bridges across the river systems that cut through agricultural country, like old scars across the landscape. The rivers out here aren't dramatic the way rivers are in photographs. They're not the sort of thing tourists seek out. The Loddon, the Campaspe, the Avoca, creeks that swell dangerously in winter and shrink to muddy trickles in summer. But between those rivers and the communities on either side of them, there was a kind of dependency that most city people never thought about. Farmers who needed to move grain and livestock, towns that relied on trade routes that hadn't changed since the gold rush era, families whose entire livelihoods depended on a crossing that could handle loaded trucks in flood conditions without so much as a groan. A failed bridge in rural Victoria wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a community, cut in half. It was a farmer watching crops rot because he couldn't get them to market. It was a town slowly strangling because the supply chain that kept it alive had snapped at the most critical point. I understood that from my first week on the job, not from any textbook, but from driving out to sites in a Land Rover with old Les Partridge, my senior engineer, who'd been doing this work since before I was born, and who had a way of standing on a riverbank and reading the landscape like a man reading a letter from someone he knew very well. Les used to say, "A bridge is a promise. You're making a promise to everyone who will ever cross it, that they can trust what you've made, and you won't be there when they cross it. You won't see their faces. You won't know their names, but the promise has to hold regardless." I thought about that a lot over the years, more than I probably let on to anyone. Margaret knew, because Margaret knew most things about me that I didn't bother saying aloud. She had that quality, a kind of patient attentiveness that made you feel thoroughly understood without having to explain yourself. She was a librarian at the Bendigo Library on View Street for over 20 years, and she brought that same quality to marriage that she brought to her work, a genuine care for what things actually meant, not just what they appeared to be. We met at a fundraiser dinner at the Shamrock Hotel on Pall Mall in 1976, one of those awkward civic events where nobody quite knows whose idea it was, but everyone comes anyway out of some vague sense of duty to the community. I spilled red wine on her cardigan within the first 10 minutes of conversation, and spent the rest of the evening convinced I'd made a catastrophic first impression. She told me later she'd decided she liked me precisely because of how flustered I got trying to apologize. She said it told her I was the kind of man who took small things seriously, and that was the kind of man she wanted around. We were married in 1978. Helen was born in 1977, which means she arrived into a world where her father was still figuring out how to be the kind of man Margaret seemed to think he already was. The years that followed were the busiest of my professional life. By the early 1980s, I'd been promoted to chief structural engineer for the Central and Northern Victoria region, which meant I had oversight of every new bridge project across a territory that stretched from Bendigo north to Echuca and west toward Mildura. I had a small team, never more than 8 engineers at any one time, and we worked out of offices on High Street in Bendigo, with drafting tables covered in calculations and site photographs pinned to every available surface. I want to be careful here because I'm not trying to paint a heroic picture of myself. I was doing a government job. I had a salary and a title and a set of responsibilities, and I carried those out as well as I knew how. That's not heroism, that's just showing up. But I will say this, I cared about the work in a way that went beyond the professional obligation. I cared about the specific places those bridges connected. I cared about the particular quality of the riverbanks and the seasonal patterns of the water, and the loads those structures would have to bear, not just in the first year, but in the 5th decade. There was a bridge over the Campaspe River near Rochester, a job that came across my desk in 1982, where the existing crossing was a timber structure that had been patched and repatched so many times it had become a kind of engineering archaeology, layer over layer of previous solutions, none of which had quite solved the underlying problem. The local council wanted the cheapest replacement possible. My recommendation was a pre-stressed concrete structure with wider clearance than the brief specified, designed to handle the once-in-a-100-year flood event that the hydrological data suggested was not merely possible, but probable within the next 40 years. There were meetings about that. There was pushback about budget. There were people above me in the organization who thought I was being unnecessarily cautious and that the additional engineering was a luxury the project couldn't afford. I held the line. I wrote the reports, showed the calculations, sat through the meetings, and held the line. Eventually, the design I specified was approved with minor modifications. The bridge was completed in 1984. In 2011, nearly 30 years later, the Campaspe flooded at levels not recorded since European settlement. Several structures in the region were compromised or destroyed. The Rochester Bridge I'd specified handled that event without incident. Farmers used it the morning after the peak flood had passed. Delivery trucks crossed it before the road had even finished draining. Nobody wrote an article about that. Nobody photographed the bridge specifically to note that it had survived. It simply did what it had always done, which was function as promised. Margaret heard about it through a friend in Rochester and mentioned it to me over dinner one evening, the way you might mention that the garden looks nice, or that you heard there was a new cafe opening on View Street. I remember setting down my fork and just sitting with that for a moment. Not pride exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that felt like a debt being honored from a very long distance. I never told Helen about it. I never mentioned it to anyone at work, because by 2011 I'd been retired for 4 years, and those kinds of conversations weren't part of my life anymore. It just went into the part of me that held the things I knew about myself, but didn't particularly need to say. Maybe that was a mistake. I don't know. It's hard to know where the line is between proper modesty and a kind of silence that ends up being its own problem. Daniel Foster came into Helen's life when she was 33. He was 29, still young enough to have that particular forward-leaning energy that makes everything seem like an acceleration toward something bigger. He'd started a small residential construction company in Bendigo that built 4 or 5 houses a year. Modest work, nothing glamorous, and he was good at it. Organized, reliable. He had the right instincts about cost and timing, and he worked hard. Over the next 15 years, he built that company into something substantial. Not huge by metropolitan standards, but significant for a regional city. 50 employees, major residential and commercial contracts across Bendigo and the surrounding district, a company vehicle fleet, and an office in Charing Cross that looked like something you'd see in Melbourne. He was, by any reasonable measure, successful. I respected that. I genuinely did. I watched him build something from the ground up, and I thought, this is a man who knows how to work. That matters. That's not a small thing. What I was slower to understand was that his definition of building something, and mine, had diverged in ways that neither of us had articulated. For Daniel, building meant accumulation, growth, contracts won, properties completed, company reputation rising, name appearing in the local paper alongside significant projects. These were the metrics of a successful life, and in his world, they were entirely reasonable metrics. For me, building had always meant something else, something that was harder to see in the short term, something that revealed itself slowly, over decades, through use, through continued function, through the morning after a flood, when the thing you made is still standing. I don't think Daniel was a bad man for having his definition. I want to make that very clear. He wasn't arrogant in a cruel way. He was simply operating inside a framework of success that had never been asked to look at itself from the outside. The Sunday dinner that changed everything happened on a warm November afternoon. Helen had made a roast, lamb, with vegetables from her garden, the kind of meal that means something when you're a widower living alone, and Sunday dinners have become the main occasion where the silence of the house doesn't feel quite as heavy. I drove over to their place on Barnard Street around noon, and we spent the early part of the afternoon on the back deck the way we often did, talking about the usual things, the business, the property market in Bendigo, how the weather had been. Somewhere after the main course, while the gravy bowl was still making its rounds, the conversation turned to a heritage restoration project Daniel had heard about, a regional government contract to restore and preserve a collection of historic structures across central Victoria, bridges, in fact, among other things, and the consortium he was considering approaching for partnership. It was a significant contract, the kind of thing that could add a new dimension to what his company was capable of. Daniel was animated about it in the way he got when something represented a genuine opportunity. He talked about the scale, the visibility, the community impact. And then, in a way that I think was meant to be a kind of generous acknowledgement of my background, he turned to me and said something about how I must have some sense of what that kind of work involved. I said yes. I'd spent most of my career on exactly that kind of work. Structural engineering for regional infrastructure. Bridges, mostly. And Daniel nodded, and there was a pause, and then he said it. Casual, conversational, not cruel, I don't think. Not intentionally. Just thoughtless in the specific way that people are thoughtless when they've never had to question what they're saying. He said, with all due respect, that I'd never really built anything that lasted. He meant commercially. He meant in the sense of a company, a brand, a legacy of the kind you could point to and say, I made that, and my name is on it, and it endures. He was contrasting himself, probably not even consciously, with a retired government engineer whose name appeared on no public building, no company, no monument, no continuing institution. He wasn't wrong by his own lights. He just had no idea what he didn't know. The silence in that room lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Helen looked down at her plate. Nobody spoke, and I understood in that moment that the silence wasn't agreement exactly, But it wasn't disagreement either. It was the silence of people who don't know how to push back against something and so simply wait for it to pass. I excused myself from the table. I thanked Helen for the meal, genuinely, because it was a lovely meal and the fact that a dinner ended badly wasn't her fault. I shook Daniel's hand, which surprised him, I think, and I drove home along Barnard Street to Mackenzie Street with the radio off and my hand steady on the wheel. I didn't cry. I'm 77. I've been through enough to know that the moments that break you don't usually arrive as catastrophes. They arrive as quiet sentences at dinner tables. They arrive in the things nobody argues with. That night I went out to my workshop, and I stood among the half-finished furniture and the smell of timber and linseed oil, and I thought about what 41 years of work actually looked like from the outside, not from my own vantage point, where I could hear Les Partridge's voice saying, "A bridge is a promise." From the outside, from the view of someone who could only see what was publicly visible, what was named, what was celebrated, what had a face and a brand and a story attached to it. And I understood for the first time with real clarity that I had spent 4 decades building in silence. The question I fell asleep asking myself that night, the question I was still asking when I woke before dawn and laced my boots and walked down to Lake Wiruna in the dark, was whether that silence had been a kind of integrity or a kind of failure. I walked the lake path as the sky went from black to deep blue to the particular shade of pale gray that comes just before the first light hits the water. The paper barks along the western edge were barely visible, their white trunks ghostly in the pre-dawn, and the surface of the lake was utterly still, the way still water has of holding the sky inside itself like a held breath. I thought about the Rochester Bridge, about a dozen other structures I could name the way a father names his children, each one different, each one carrying the specific logic of its particular place and moment. The Pyramid Hill crossing that we'd had to redesign twice to satisfy a geotechnical issue that none of us saw coming. The Kerrang footbridge that the council had specifically requested because the old timber walkway had become impassable in winter and elderly residents were being effectively isolated from the main street. The overpass near Elmore that I'd been proudest of structurally, an elegant load distribution solution that had given me more professional satisfaction than almost anything else I'd done, but which to a passing motorist was simply a piece of road that happened to go over another piece of road. None of them had my name on them in any way a person would notice unless they already knew to look. That had always seemed right to me. Infrastructure is not about the engineer. It's about the function. The moment you start designing things so that they're monuments to yourself, you've started making decisions for the wrong reason. But standing there at Lake Wiruna at 6 in the morning with a sentence echoing in my head, I found myself wondering whether there was a version of that principle that tipped into something less noble, whether the complete absence of any claim to one's own work was less about proper modesty and more about a fear of being seen that had calcified over 40 years into something that looked like principle but wasn't quite. Margaret would have had something to say about that. She always knew the difference between the things I genuinely believed and the things I'd simply convinced myself I believed. I could hear her voice in the particular way I always heard it when I walked the lake in the mornings. Not literally, nothing as consoling as that. Just the shape of what she would have said, which was usually a question rather than a conclusion. I stopped at the eastern end of the lake where there's a bench facing the water, one I'd sat on so many times over the years that the slats have a quality of familiarity I'd find hard to describe, and I sat down and looked out across the water and let the morning come. By the time I got back to the house, the sun was fully up and I felt, if not resolved, at least quiet again. I made tea and ate toast, standing at the kitchen window and watched the red wattlebirds in the grevillea beside the fence, and thought about very little in particular, which is sometimes the most useful kind of thinking. The second day after the dinner, I walked down to my favorite cafe on View Street, a place called Dudley's, run by a man named Barry who'd been making strong, flat whites since before most of the younger cafe owners in Bendigo were born, and I sat with the morning paper for an hour and a half the way I always did. Barry asked how I was going. I said fine. He said I looked like I was chewing on something. I said maybe a bit. He put a second flat white down in front of me without asking and went back behind the counter, which is exactly the right thing to do when a man tells you he's thinking things through. I read the paper. I thought about the bridge at Rochester. I thought about Les Partridge, who died in 1998 and whom I still missed in the particular way you miss people who taught you something that turned out to matter more than you realized at the time. I thought about Daniel's face when he said what he said. Not mean, not contemptuous, just entirely at ease, which was somehow harder than contempt would have been. I walked home from View Street along Pall Mall, past the old law courts and the Shamrock Hotel where I'd spilled wine on Margaret's cardigan 48 years ago, and I thought about how a city holds time differently from the people who live in it. The buildings on Pall Mall were the same buildings I'd walked past for 50 years. The street was the same street. Only the people moved through it and changed. I wonder sometimes what it would mean to be a building, to be a bridge, to hold your position while everything else moved through you. I was still thinking about that when I turned into Mackenzie Street and saw that the gate to my front path was open, which I always left closed. And then I saw him. He was standing on the veranda. His clothes were creased, like he'd slept in them, or not slept at all. His eyes had the reddened look of a man who'd been awake longer than was good for him. He was holding something against his chest, a leather document case, old and worn at the corners, the kind that takes decades of handling to develop that particular softness. He heard me on the path and turned, and there was something in his face I hadn't seen there before. Not the confidence he usually wore like a well-fitted suit, something rawer than that, something that hadn't had time yet to be arranged into anything presentable. Before I could speak, he said, "I owe you an apology, but first you need to see what's inside." I looked at that leather case and something tightened in my chest that I couldn't quite name. Whatever was in there, I could see from his face that it had already changed something, that the man standing on my veranda at dawn was not the same man who'd sat across the dinner table 2 nights ago. What I didn't yet know was how much was about to change for me as well. I stood there for a moment just looking at him, not saying anything. Not because I was angry. The anger, whatever version of it I'd carried home from that dinner, had mostly dissolved somewhere along the lake path 2 mornings ago. I stood there because I needed a second to read the situation properly. 77 years teaches you that the first few seconds of an unexpected encounter carry more information than people usually realize, and what I was reading in Daniel's face was something I hadn't expected to find there. He looked genuinely undone, not theatrical about it. Daniel had never been a theatrical man. That was one of the things I'd always respected about him, actually. He was direct, sometimes to a fault, but he didn't perform. So the state he was in on my veranda that morning wasn't a performance. The creased shirt, the eyes that had seen too many hours without sleep, the way he was holding that leather case against his chest like it was something fragile that needed protecting, none of that was staged. I said, "Come inside then. Put the kettle on." And that was that. He sat at my kitchen table while I made tea, and I gave him the same courtesy I'd have wanted someone to give me in a similar state. I didn't ask anything while the kettle was heating. I got out 2 mugs, the proper ceramic ones that Margaret had always insisted on, rather than the travel mugs Helen kept trying to replace them with. And I made the tea strong because he looked like he needed it strong, and I set his in front of him and sat down across the table and waited. He put the leather case on the table between us. He didn't open it immediately. He just rested his hands on top of it and looked at me, and I could see him assembling the words in the particular effortful way of a man who's rehearsed something so many times it started to feel false, and so he's throwing out the rehearsal and trying to find the actual words underneath it. He said he'd been at a regional engineering conference in Ballarat, 3 days, starting the day after the Sunday dinner. He'd gone there partly for the networking, partly because his company was building toward a tender for a heritage restoration contract that involved some structural engineering assessment he wanted to understand better before committing to the partnership. On the second day of the conference, there was a presentation by a heritage historian from the University of Melbourne. The presentation was about infrastructure legacy in rural Victoria, specifically about the wave of bridge construction and structural engineering that had reshaped regional connectivity across the state during the 1970s and 80s. It was an academic presentation, the kind Daniel wouldn't normally have found particularly compelling, but the heritage restoration contract context made it relevant to sit through. The historian had sourced archival photographs, engineering records, government documentation, photographs of bridge construction sites from across central and northern Victoria, some taken during the building phase and some taken recently to show the structures as they currently stood. And the historian had done something unusual for that kind of presentation. Rather than treating the infrastructure as anonymous public works, she had specifically researched and named the engineering staff responsible for each structure, because her argument was that regional infrastructure in Victoria had an underdocumented human history that deserved proper acknowledgement. Daniel paused there, picked up his mug, set it back down without drinking. He said that about halfway through the presentation, a photograph came up on the screen, a construction site photograph, clearly from the early 1980s based on the equipment and the clothing of the workers visible in the frame. A bridge over a river. He didn't know the river at the time. And in the caption beneath the photograph, in the standard formatting of archival documentation, it said, Chief Structural Engineer, G. Whitmore. He said he almost didn't register it. His eyes moved past it, the way you move past most text in a slideshow presentation. And then something pulled him back. He said he sat very still for about 10 seconds, and then he got out his phone and started taking photographs of the screen. I listened to all of this without interrupting. There was something happening in my chest that I wasn't sure how to describe. Not pride, not vindication, not any of the things you might expect. Something quieter, something closer to the feeling of being recognized after a long time in the dark, when the recognition is so unexpected that your first response is not relief, but a kind of careful disbelief. Daniel opened the leather case. The documents inside were copies. He'd spent time in the conference hotel room, and then the following 2 days gathering them, which explained the condition he was in. He'd contacted the historian directly after the presentation. He'd accessed the Public Record Office Victoria's online archives. He'd found digitized editions of engineering journals from the 1980s. He'd located newspaper archives from regional Victorian papers, the Bendigo Advertiser, the Campaspe News, the Riverine Herald, that had covered bridge openings and infrastructure completions in ways that the major metropolitan papers never bothered to. He spread the documents across my kitchen table one by one. I looked at them the way you look at something from your own past that you haven't seen in a very long time. Not quite like looking at something external, more like looking at a reflection that you'd forgotten existed. There were engineering drawings, not originals, printed reproductions of digitized versions, slightly degraded in quality, but readable. I recognized my own technical notation immediately, the particular shorthand I'd developed over the early years of my career for marking load-bearing specifications on structural drawings. You develop a handwriting in engineering the same way you develop it in prose, and mine was distinctly mine. There was a letter from the Shire of Campaspe, dated November 1984, formally acknowledging the completion of the Rochester Bridge project and specifically noting the quality of the structural engineering assessment that had resulted in a more robust design than the original brief had specified. It was a formal letter, bureaucratic in tone, the kind that gets filed and forgotten. I had a copy of it somewhere in the workshop, in a box with other professional papers I hadn't opened in years. There was an article from the Bendigo Advertiser, 2012. I had not seen this one. It was a feature piece on the Campaspe flooding of 2011. I'd heard about the flooding, of course, everyone in the region had, and about the infrastructure that had and hadn't held up. The article mentioned the Rochester Bridge specifically. It quoted a local farmer named Hector Pringle, who said something like, "That bridge didn't even blink. We were crossing it the next morning like nothing had happened. Built to last, that one. Whoever designed it knew what they were doing. no name. But I knew what they were doing. Daniel was watching my face while I read. I looked up at him, and he had the expression of a man who'd expected the documents to constitute an apology in themselves, and was now realizing that the situation was more complicated than that, because the man he was apologizing to wasn't displaying the response he'd anticipated. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was something else that I'm not sure I can name precisely even now. I'll tell you what I was thinking. I was thinking about Les Partridge again, about a conversation we'd had on a riverbank near Pyramid Hill in the winter of 1976, when I was 27 years old and still new enough to the work that every problem felt like a test I might fail. We'd been standing in mud up to the ankles, looking at a survey site that had complications we hadn't anticipated, and I'd said something impatient about wanting to just get the design done and move on to the next project. And Les had looked at me in the way he had, sideways, unhurried, and said, "The next project will have the same problems. Every crossing is its own country. You have to learn the language each time." I thought he was talking about engineering. Eventually, I understood he was talking about something larger. I pushed the documents back toward Daniel gently, and I said, "Why did you think I needed to see these?" He sat with that for a moment. He said, "Because I told you that you'd never built anything that lasted." And I was wrong. And I think you've probably been too quiet about all of this for too long. And I wanted you to see that other people have noticed, even if no one said it to your face. I got up and refilled both mugs. I stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out at the garden, the grevilleas, the old lemon tree, the workshop at the back with its slightly rusting corrugated iron roof that I kept meaning to replace. The morning light was doing something particular to the lemon tree, catching the leaves at an angle that made them look almost luminous. Margaret had planted that tree. It had been barely a sapling when she put it in the ground. I came back to the table and sat down. I said, "Daniel, I want to tell you something, and I want you to actually hear it. Not just listen to it, but hear it. Can you do that?" He said yes. I said, "I've never been quiet about my work because I was ashamed of it. And I've never been quiet because I didn't think it mattered. I've been quiet about it because the work was never about me." You understand the difference? He looked at me carefully. I could see him trying to. I said, "When I designed a bridge, the brief wasn't to create something that would be associated with my name. The brief was to create a crossing that would serve the people and the place for as long as it reasonably could. The moment I started designing for recognition, I would have started making different decisions, possibly worse decisions. You follow?" He said he thought he did. I said, "The documents on this table, they matter to me. I won't pretend they don't. But not because they prove anything about my worth or yours. They matter because they're evidence that the work held, that it kept its promise. That's all." There was a silence between us then, but it was a different kind of silence from the one at the dinner table. That one had been the silence of a room looking away. This one was the silence of two people actually occupying the same moment together. And if you found any part of this story speaking to something in your own life, something about work done quietly, about value that doesn't announce itself, about the gap between what we build and what we get credit for, I'd ask you to do something right now before you forget. Hit the subscribe button, leave this channel switched on, because the stories I'm going to keep telling are exactly this kind, ordinary lives that turned out to contain something worth understanding. Not famous lives, not glamorous ones, just lives lived with a kind of attention that tends to go unnoticed until the moment someone finally looks closely enough. Daniel stayed at my kitchen table for nearly 3 hours that morning. We talked in a way we had never talked before. Not about business, not about property markets or construction contracts or the logistical challenges of heritage restoration. We talked about the actual substance of things, what it meant to build something, what it meant for that thing to last, what it meant to spend a career doing work that served people you would never meet, in places you might not return to, across spans of time longer than any individual could fully witness. I told him about Les Partridge. I told him about the Pyramid Hill site and the winter mud and the lesson about every crossing being its own country. I told him about the Rochester Bridge, not the version he'd read in the 2012 newspaper article, but the version I'd lived through, the meetings and the pushback, and the line I'd held on the flood specifications. I told him what it had felt like in 2011 when I heard the bridge had come through without incident, and how I hadn't told anyone about it, and whether that had been a mistake. He listened with an attention I hadn't seen from him before, not the forward-leaning energy of a man absorbing information he can use, something more receptive than that. The attention of someone who's had his framework quietly dismantled and is sitting among the pieces, trying to understand what they actually mean. He asked me questions I didn't expect. He asked about the technical challenge I'd found most difficult across my career. Not the most prestigious project, the most difficult. I told him about a footbridge specification in Kerrang in 1987, where we'd had a soil stability problem that none of our standard solutions addressed cleanly, and we'd had to develop a modified foundation approach that I'd never seen in any textbook, and which I'd spent 3 weeks verifying through calculation before I trusted it. He asked what that 3 weeks had felt like. I said it had felt like being responsible for something that had to be right, in a way that allowed absolutely no margin for a merely good attempt. He sat with that phrase for a while. I watched him sitting with it. He asked about Margaret, not in a formal way. We'd talked about her before, in the careful way people talk about the recently bereaved, saying the right things. He asked what she'd thought about my relationship with my work, whether she'd understood it. I said she'd understood it better than I had, most of the time. I said she'd had a word for the way I worked that I'd always remembered. She called it accountable silence. She meant that I wasn't quiet about my work because I didn't value it, but because I held myself accountable to it in a way that made public declarations seem beside the point. She thought it was mostly a virtue and occasionally a frustration, and she was probably right on both counts. Daniel smiled at that, a real smile, unperformed. The first one I'd seen from him since he'd appeared on my veranda. He said, "She sounds like she was extraordinary." I said, "She was exactly ordinary in all the ways that turned out to matter most, which is the highest thing I know how to say about a person." The morning had moved well into midday by the time we stopped talking. The light in the kitchen had shifted from the early slant of dawn to the fuller, more honest light of midday, the kind that finds every surface and doesn't flatter any of them. My kitchen looked like what it was, the kitchen of an old man living alone, functional and cared for, but not decorated, not curated. Daniel gathered the documents back into the leather case. He was careful with them, handling them with a deliberateness that I noticed and didn't comment on. He stood up from the table and looked around the kitchen for a moment, in the way people do when they're preparing to leave a place and know something has changed in themselves between arriving and departing. He said, "I came here to give you those, but I think I got more than I gave." I said I thought we'd probably come out even. He shook my hand at the front door, different from the handshake at the dinner table 2 nights ago, which had been a gesture of politeness in a difficult moment. This one had weight in it. He held it a beat longer than was purely functional. He walked down the path to his car, and I watched him go, and then I went inside and stood in the kitchen with the morning still hanging in the air, and I thought about what Les Partridge had said all those years ago. Every crossing is its own country. You have to learn the language each time. I'd always understood that to mean the particular challenges of particular engineering problems. I was beginning to understand it might mean something larger, something about the crossings between people, the gaps that develop, not from malice, but from different languages of meaning that have never been properly translated. Daniel had looked at my life and seen absence, no company, no name on a building, no visible monument. And from inside his framework, that reading was internally consistent. It wasn't cruelty. It was the result of never having been offered a different language for what success might look like. I hadn't offered him that language. I'd never offered it to Helen either, not properly. I'd assumed that the work spoke for itself, that anyone paying attention would understand its terms. But that assumption required a kind of attentiveness that most people aren't equipped to bring unless someone gives them the starting point. I'd never given anyone the starting point. I washed the mugs. I swept the kitchen floor, which didn't strictly need sweeping, but which gave my hands something to do while my mind continued its own work. I went out to the workshop in the afternoon and spent 2 hours on the chair I was restoring, a Federation-era cedar armchair with a broken rear leg and a seat that had been recovered badly sometime in the 1960s, with a vinyl that was now splitting and yellowing. I'd stripped the vinyl back already and found the original horsehair padding underneath, compressed but intact, salvageable if I was patient with it. There's a particular satisfaction in restoring furniture that I find difficult to articulate to people who haven't done it. It has something in common with bridge engineering, actually. The attention to underlying structure, the understanding that surface appearance is not the measure of integrity, the patience required to work with the logic of what something was originally made to be, rather than imposing a different intention onto it. You can't restore a chair by deciding it should be something other than what it is. You have to understand its original nature and work with that. Margaret had always said I brought more tenderness to broken furniture than most men brought to living things. I'm not sure that was entirely a compliment, but it wasn't entirely wrong either. Late in the afternoon, I walked back down to Lake Wiruna. The light at that time of day does something to the surface of the lake that the morning light doesn't. There's a warmth in the late afternoon reflection, a kind of amber depth that the cooler morning colors don't have. A pair of black swans were moving slowly along the northern edge of the lake, unhurried, following some private geometry of their own. A few people were walking the path. A man I knew slightly named Paul Chambers, who always walked with his hands behind his back. A couple in their 60s moving at the companionable pace of people who have been walking together for a very long time and no longer need to negotiate their speed. I sat on my bench at the eastern end and watched the swans and thought about Daniel, and the leather case and the documents spread across my kitchen table and Les Partridge and Margaret and the Rochester Bridge and the particular feeling of standing on a finished structure for the first time, before it has been open to traffic, when it is still entirely yours in the way that something can only be yours before the world begins using it and making it its own. That moment, standing on a finished bridge before the first vehicle crosses it, is something I have never adequately described to anyone. The structure is complete. The calculations have been verified. Every element is performing exactly the function you specified, and in a matter of hours it will pass out of your hands and into the custody of everyone who will ever cross it, which will be thousands of people a day for as long as it stands, which, if you've done your job properly, will be longer than either of you will live. It is the most profound form of letting go I know. You build the most careful thing you are capable of building, and then you give it away entirely. Not to a person, to a purpose, to a need that was there before you and will continue after you. And you walk away, and if you've done it right, your name might appear in a government archive somewhere, in a caption beneath a construction photograph, in a letter from a shire council, filed in a records office that most people will never visit. That is the entirety of the recognition, and for most of my career I had found it sufficient. Sitting on that bench in the late afternoon light, I found myself asking whether it was still sufficient. Not because Daniel's words had changed my values. They hadn't, not fundamentally. But because the conversation that morning had opened something that I realized I'd been keeping more tightly closed than was perhaps wise. The difference between not needing recognition and not permitting it. The difference between proper humility and a kind of loneliness that had dressed itself up as principle. I wasn't sure, sitting there, which side of that line I'd been on. What I did know was that something was shifting. In Daniel, clearly. I could see it in the way he'd held those documents, in the quality of his listening, in the different weight of his handshake at the door. But in me as well, something that had been inert for a long time was beginning to move. A few days later, Daniel called. He said he'd been thinking about what I'd told him, about the structures I'd designed, the specific places they connected, the communities that depended on them. He said he'd been doing more research. He said he wanted to ask me something, but he wanted to ask it properly, not over the phone. He said, "Would you be willing to take a drive with me, out to some of the bridges? I'd like to see them, and I'd like to see them with you." I stood in my kitchen with the phone and I looked out at the lemon tree and I thought about 41 years of structures standing in places I hadn't visited in decades, about crossings that were still keeping their promise to people who didn't know the promise had been made. I said yes. I didn't know then what that drive would show us both. I didn't know what Daniel was planning, or what he'd already begun to put in motion, or what was waiting for us at the end of those country roads. But the morning we set out from Mackenzie Street, heading west into the pale light of early autumn, with the leather case sitting on the back seat and the heater running low against the September chill, I had the particular feeling that comes rarely and is always worth paying attention to, the feeling that something is about to be properly understood. We left Bendigo just after 7 in the morning. Daniel had pulled up outside the Mackenzie Street house in a dark gray four-wheel drive that was cleaner than I expected from a man who ran a construction company. I'd always associated that kind of work with vehicles that looked like they'd been driven through several paddocks in succession. He'd brought a thermos of coffee and 2 travel mugs, which I noted and appreciated without commenting on. Small gestures of consideration tell you more about a person than most of what they say. I had the leather case on the back seat. He'd left it with me after the kitchen table conversation, which had surprised me at the time. Now it made sense. We were going to the places those documents described, and there was something appropriate about the records traveling back toward the structures they documented. The first destination was the Rochester Bridge. I hadn't been there in 11 years. The last time was 2013, a year after the flood, when I'd driven out on a quiet Tuesday for no particular reason I could have named to anyone. I'd parked on the eastern bank and walked out to the middle of the span and stood there for about 20 minutes looking at the water, which was low and calm and entirely unlike the force it had been during the flood event. Then I'd driven home. I hadn't told anyone I'd gone. We headed south out of Bendigo on the McIver Highway before turning northwest toward Rochester, and for the first 20 minutes or so, neither of us said much. The landscape does that to you. The flat agricultural country north of Bendigo in early autumn has a particular quality of light and space that tends to make conversation feel unnecessary. The paddocks were coming off harvest, the soil turned and dark in long furrows, with the occasional gray-green line of eucalypts marking a fence line or a creek. The sky was very wide and very pale, the kind of autumn sky that looks like the blue has been diluted, and the road ran arrow straight for long stretches in the way that country roads do when there's nothing in the landscape requiring them to turn. Daniel asked me about the Rochester project specifically, when it had come across my desk, what the original brief had said, what the challenges had been. I told him what I'd told you earlier, the timber structure that had been patched past the point of honest repair, the council's preference for the cheapest solution, the pushback on the flood specifications. He asked, "How did you know about the 100-year flood event? How did you know to design for something that hadn't happened in living memory?" I said, "You look at the hydrological record. You look at the shape of the riverbank, the old flood marks, the way the vegetation patterns up the slope, what the farmers in the area can tell you about the highest they've ever seen the water. And then you don't design for what has happened. You design for what could happen, because the thing you're building will still be there when it does." He drove with one hand on the wheel and thought about that for a while. He said, "I've never designed anything for what could happen. I've always designed for what the client specified, plus a comfortable margin." I said, "That's not wrong. That's responsible engineering. But infrastructure is different from commercial construction. A bridge serves a community indefinitely. It's not finished when it's handed over to the client. It's just beginning." We came into Rochester from the south and followed the main street through town, a modest country town with a grain co-op and a hardware store and a couple of cafes, and the kind of quiet mid-morning activity that regional Victoria does on weekday mornings, unhurried and purposeful simultaneously. Daniel pulled the car into a small gravel area on the eastern bank of the river. We got out. The bridge looked, from a distance, exactly as it should look. Unremarkable. That was the correct response to it. I want to be clear about that. A bridge that draws attention to itself has usually made a mistake somewhere. The Rochester Bridge was a functional, pre-stressed concrete structure, well maintained, doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was to carry vehicles and agricultural loads across the Campaspe River reliably and without drama. I walked to the center of the span, the way I always had on finished structures. Old habit. Daniel walked beside me. We stood there and watched the river. The Campaspe was running at a moderate level, clear enough to see the weed patterns on the bottom in the shallower sections near the bank. A pair of wood ducks moved upstream along the edge. On the western bank there was a paddock, where a farmer was moving through a gate on a tractor, a plume of pale dust rising behind him. Daniel said, "He doesn't know, does he?" "That farmer. He just crosses it." I said, "No. Why would he? It's a bridge. You cross it, and you think about where you're going." Daniel looked at the deck beneath his feet. He said, "I've been in this business for 15 years, and I've never stood on something I built and thought about whether the person who lives in it knows my name. I just thought about whether they were happy with the finishes. I didn't say anything to that. Sometimes silence is the more precise response." We stood there for several minutes. A delivery truck came across from the western end, a medium-sized refrigerated vehicle, moving at normal highway speed. The bridge didn't move. The deck didn't flex in any perceivable way. The truck crossed and continued along the road, and was gone in 30 seconds, and the bridge was exactly as it had been before. I thought, 42 years, give or take. You've been keeping that promise for 42 years, and you didn't need me here to do it. There's a particular emotion that I've never found the right word for. It's what you feel when something you made continues doing exactly what you intended it to do, long after you stopped being involved in it. Not pride, quite. Pride implies the achievement is yours. This was different. More like witnessing than owning. More like being allowed to see that the work had gone on without you, and had not needed you to continue, which is exactly what you'd hoped for, and somehow still manages to surprise you when you see it. I realized at that moment on the Rochester Bridge that I was not going to be able to explain adequately to Daniel what I was feeling, and that was all right. Some things are better demonstrated than explained, and that's precisely why he'd asked me to come on the drive. If this story is landing somewhere in you, if something about a life's work being invisible until someone finally looks closely resonates, then I want to ask you to do something simple. Subscribe to this channel. Because we're not finished with Graham Whitmore yet, not by a long way. And the stories that are coming are going to ask you to think about the things in your own life that have gone unwitnessed, and what that silence actually means. We left Rochester mid-morning and drove west. The second bridge on Daniel's list was one I hadn't thought about in years, a crossing over the Avoca River near the town of Pyramid Hill, not technically over the Avoca itself, but over a tributary that fed into it from the east, a seasonal watercourse that ran strongly in winter and spring, and reduced to a chain of waterholes in summer. The crossing there had been a relatively modest project by the standards of my later career, but it had been one of the first major jobs where I'd had full design responsibility. Les Partridge still nominally involved, but stepping back deliberately to let me carry it. The geotechnical problem I'd mentioned to Daniel at the kitchen table, the soil stability issue that had taken 3 weeks of calculation to resolve, had happened here. The substrate on the eastern bank had an unexpected clay layer at a depth that our initial surveys hadn't caught, which meant the foundation specification I developed from the survey data was wrong, in a way that would have had consequences over time. We'd caught it during the construction phase, which was not where you want to catch a problem, but infinitely better than catching it afterward. I'd redesigned the foundation approach over a weekend that I still remembered with a particular clarity. The dining room table, covered in calculations, Margaret bringing tea at regular intervals without commentary, less on the phone. Sunday morning walking through the revised load distribution logic with me in the methodical way he had. We'd corrected it. The structure was built to the revised specification, and it had stood for over 40 years. I told Daniel this story as we drove, not the polished version, the actual one, with the anxiety of the discovery and the long weekend and the Sunday morning phone call, and the specific relief of knowing the solution was sound before the concrete was poured. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, "You never told anyone about that. The mistake you caught." I said, "It wasn't a mistake that made it into the structure. It was a problem that was identified and corrected during the process. That's what the process is for." He said, "Most people in my industry would never admit to a problem they'd caught and corrected. They'd be worried about how it reflected on them." I said, "If you're more worried about how problems reflect on you than about whether they've been properly solved, you're working for the wrong reason." He said that quietly, to himself almost, as if filing it somewhere. The Pyramid Hill Bridge was smaller than Rochester, a single-span structure over a narrower crossing, serving a rural road with lighter traffic loads, but it was in remarkable condition for its age. The concrete had that aged quality that good concrete develops, where the surface texture has weathered to something almost organic, as if the material has made its peace with the landscape around it. There was lichen on the underside of the parapets in patches of gray-green that looked, if you were in a certain mood, almost decorative. We parked on the gravel verge and walked out onto it. There was no traffic at all. We'd been there perhaps 10 minutes before a single ute came through from the north. A farmer in a broad-brimmed hat who lifted 2 fingers off the steering wheel in the minimal acknowledgement that regional Victorians use for strangers on country roads. He crossed without slowing. He didn't look at us particularly. Daniel walked to the railing and leaned over to look at the underside of the structure. He was quiet for a long time. I stood near the center of the span and let him look. He said, "The foundation work is completely invisible. You'd have no idea from up here what went into it." I said, "That's the correct outcome." He turned and looked at me. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, not the way you think you should answer." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "Does it bother you?" Genuinely, not philosophically, not as a matter of professional principle. Does it actually, honestly bother you that nobody knows your name in connection with any of this? I stood with that question for a while. The wind had picked up slightly, and it moved across the bridge with a low sound that you feel more than hear. The kind of thing that reminds you of the scale of open space in flat country. The tributary below us was running clear and cold, the waterweed bending slightly in the current. I said, "I'll tell you something honest. There were nights, particular nights, usually when the work had been especially difficult or when I'd held a line that cost me something politically, where I thought about recognition, not obsessively, not bitterly. But it was there, the awareness that what I was doing was significant, and that the significance was almost entirely invisible." He nodded. I said, "But here's the also true thing. In the morning I would get up and go back to the work, and the work was sufficient, not because I'd convinced myself that recognition didn't matter, but because the work itself was genuinely interesting, and the responsibility was genuinely real, and the need it served was genuinely important. Those 3 things together were enough to get up for. They were enough most days." He said, "And the other days?" I said, "Margaret." "On the other days, Margaret." He smiled again. "That real one." We ate lunch in Pyramid Hill at a small cafe on the main street, where the owner, a woman in her late 50s named Cheryl, brought out pies and tea and a level of cheerful efficiency that felt entirely right for that particular moment. She asked where we were from. Daniel said Bendigo. She said she'd lived here her whole life, that her family had farmed the area for 3 generations, that the town was quieter than it used to be, but still had good bones. Good bones. I thought about that phrase. Daniel asked her, conversationally, whether she used the bridge on the Eastern Road much. She said, "Oh, all the time. We all do. It's been there forever, that bridge. You'd be lost without it." She said it without thinking. The way you say things about reliable things that have always been there, not as a statement about their value, but as a simple fact of the landscape. The way you'd say the hill is there, the sky is there, the bridge is there. Daniel looked at me across the table. I looked back. I didn't say anything. After Pyramid Hill, we drove toward Kerrang, which was the furthest point of the day. The landscape changed slightly as we moved northwest, flatter still, the soil lighter, the vegetation acquiring that slightly drier quality that you notice as you move toward the Murray Basin. The afternoon light was doing what it always does in that country in autumn, lowering earlier than you expect, and turning the paddocks a color between gold and copper that photographs never quite capture. I told Daniel about the Kerrang footbridge as we drove, the council brief, the isolation issue for older residents, the soil stability challenges that had required the modified foundation approach. I told him about the specific calculation work, not in technical detail, but in the experiential detail, what it felt like to be 3 weeks into a problem that didn't have a standard solution, to be working at the edge of your established knowledge in a situation where the consequences of getting it wrong were borne by people who trusted you to get it right. He said, "You were 27 on that job?" I said, 27 on Pyramid Hill, 38 on Kerrang. Different periods, similar problems. He said, "I'm 45 now, and I'm not sure I've ever worked at the edge of my established knowledge on anything. I've always stayed well inside what I knew could work." I said, "That's sensible risk management in commercial construction. There's nothing wrong with it." He said, "But it's not the same thing." I said, "No. The Kerrang footbridge was a pedestrian structure on the western edge of town, connecting a residential area to the main street across a drainage channel that widened significantly in winter. It was narrow by vehicle bridge standards, 3 meters deck width, functional railings, a slight curve to the alignment that followed the natural line of the bank, rather than cutting straight across. When we arrived, there were 2 people on it, a man in his late 60s walking a dog, a large gray-muzzled dog of the kind that moves with deliberate slowness but still covers ground, and a woman perhaps 10 years younger who was paused at the railing, looking down at the water the way people pause on pedestrian bridges, for no particular reason, except that water visible from above has a quality of invitation to contemplation that I've never been able to fully account for. We waited on the eastern bank until they'd both crossed. Then we walked out onto the structure. The curve of the alignment was more noticeable from the deck than from the bank. You got a sense, walking it, of following the intention of the landscape rather than imposing a geometry on it. I'd argued for that curve in a meeting that I remembered as particularly frustrating, where the council representative kept asking why we couldn't just run it straight. I'd said, because the straight line requires a more complex foundation at this location than a modest curve, and the curve is more pleasant to walk. He'd seemed unconvinced by both arguments, but had eventually approved the design. Daniel walked the curve twice, back and forth, slowly, looking at everything: the deck surface, the railings, the connection details at the abutments where the structure met the bank. He was looking at it with a professional eye, I realized. The eye of a man who builds things and knows how to read what a structure is telling you about how it was made. He stopped at the center of the curve and looked back toward the eastern bank. He said, "The curve makes it feel like it belongs here." I said, "That was the intention." He said, "Whoever made this liked it here, in this specific place. You can feel that." I didn't answer immediately. I stood at the railing and looked down at the drainage channel, which was running at a moderate winter level, and I thought about the 1987 weekend, and the calculations and Margaret's tea and Les Partridge's voice on the Sunday morning phone call. I thought about how the curve of this bridge had been a decision made in the abstract, on a drafting table, on a site plan, in a meeting room, and had translated somehow into a material fact in the landscape that a person could feel while walking it nearly 40 years later. He said, "Can I ask you something else?" I said yes. He said, "Did you ever walk a bridge you designed after it had been open for a long time? Just walk it like a regular person? Not to inspect it, not professionally, just to use it?" I said, "Yes, several times over the years." He said, "What was that like?" I thought about how to answer that honestly, rather than neatly. I said, "It was like reading a letter you wrote a long time ago to someone you don't know. You recognize the voice. But the person who wrote it had different information than you have now. And you understand things about what you were trying to say that you didn't quite understand when you were saying it." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "I've been building things for 15 years, and I have never felt anything like that." I said, "I know," not unkindly, just as a fact. We drove back toward Bendigo as the light was fading, the sky behind us going through that sequence of colors that a wide, flat sky does at the end of an autumn day, the pale blue deepening through gold to a band of deep orange near the horizon, and above it the first faint stars appearing in the darkening east. Daniel had the heater running, and neither of us talked much for the first half hour of the drive, which felt comfortable rather than awkward. We'd used up a certain amount of language during the day, and were now in the quieter mode that follows a lot of genuine conversation. Somewhere south of Rochester, with the paddocks dark on either side and the road unrolling in the headlights, Daniel said something that I've thought about many times since. He said, "I've been measuring my career by what I accumulate: contracts, company size, reputation. I thought that was what building meant, having more to show." I waited. He said, "But what you've shown me today is that the things that last, really last, are the ones that stop being about the person who made them almost immediately. They become about the people who use them, and the person who made them is only in it if you look very carefully at things most people never think to look at." I said, "That's about right." He said, "I'm not sure I know how to work that way." I said, "You learned the language of engineering in a day. You can learn other languages." He was quiet again for a while. Then he said something that surprised me. He said he'd been thinking about something since the kitchen table conversation, about his company's practice of naming projects, how every major development his company completed was named for an investor, or for a geographic feature, or for a brand sensibility, names chosen for marketing rather than for meaning. He said he'd been wondering what it would mean to do it differently. I asked what he meant. He said he wasn't sure yet, that it was still forming, that he needed to think it through properly before he said it out loud, because he didn't want to say something he didn't mean in the same way he'd said something he didn't mean at the dinner table. I said, "Fair enough." He said, "But I want you to know something. What you showed me today, those bridges, that's changed something in how I'm going to think about what I build. I can't tell you exactly how yet, but it's changed." I said, "I know." He dropped me at Mackenzie Street just after 8 in the evening. The house was dark inside, and I went in and turned on the kitchen light and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the table where we'd sat that morning. The kitchen felt different, not the silence of a man living alone, which I was used to and had made a kind of accommodation with. Something else. The particular quality of a space where something important has recently happened, and the air hasn't quite settled back to ordinary yet. I made dinner, something simple, a bowl of soup and toast, and ate it at the kitchen table, and then went out to the workshop and sat among the furniture in the lamplight without working, just sitting. The cedar armchair was there, half restored, the original horsehair padding still needing attention. The rear leg I'd repaired was solid now, the joint held with hide glue and properly clamped. The chair would be good for another 50 years if it was treated reasonably. I sat across from it in my usual chair and looked at it. I thought about Daniel's face on those 3 bridges, the way his professional eye had moved across the structures, reading them, The moment on the Kerrang footbridge when he'd said, "You can feel that whoever made this liked it here." I hadn't agreed aloud because agreeing would have required me to acknowledge something about my own relationship to that work that I found difficult to articulate even to myself. But the truth was, yes, I had liked it there. I had liked every place those bridges connected, in the specific way you like a place when you've spent enough time understanding its particular logic, its hydrology, its soil, its seasonal rhythms, its human need. You don't design well for a place you haven't genuinely attended to. And genuine attention, sustained over months or years, produces something that might reasonably be called affection. I had loved those places. I had loved them in the particular way that work well done for a specific purpose, in a specific location, produces love. Not the love of possession, not the love of attachment, but the love of real comprehension, of knowing a thing as it actually is. And it had never once occurred to me to say so. Not to Helen, not to Margaret, except obliquely, not to anyone. I sat in the workshop until nearly midnight, which is late for a man of 77 who gets up before dawn, and somewhere in the quiet, with the cedar chair across from me and the lamp throwing long shadows across the workshop floor, I had the sense that something was not yet finished, that the day had opened something that still had further to go. I didn't know then that Daniel had made a phone call that evening before he'd even arrived home, that he'd called his company's project manager and begun a conversation about something that had nothing to do with anything we'd discussed on the drive, that he'd been thinking about it since Pyramid Hill, since Cheryl in the cafe had said the bridge is there. You'd be lost without it, with that complete casualness of someone describing a thing whose value they can no longer imagine being without. I didn't know what he was already setting in motion, but I would find out, and when I did, I would understand something about the difference between a lesson learned and a lesson lived, a distinction that turned out to matter more than I had any way of anticipating, sitting in my workshop at midnight with a half-restored cedar chair and the memory of 3 bridges, and a day that had quietly rearranged something permanent inside me. The weeks that followed that drive settled into a quietness that felt different from ordinary quiet. Not the absence of things. Happening. Things were happening. I simply wasn't yet aware of most of them. It was more the quality of quiet that descends after a significant event has passed through your life, and the immediate intensity of it has softened, but the deeper adjustments are still working themselves out beneath the surface. The kind of quiet that feels, if you pay attention to it, less like stillness and more like something moving slowly through deep water. I kept my routine. That's what 77 years teaches you better than almost anything else. The value of the ordinary day maintained through extraordinary ones. I walked Lake Wiruna before sunrise. I went to Dudley's on View Street for my flat white and the morning paper. I worked in the workshop on the cedar armchair, which was coming along well. The horsehair padding had responded to careful treatment, and I'd sourced a piece of fabric from a restorer in Castlemaine that was a reasonable period match for what the original upholstery would have been. I greeted the neighbors I always greeted, had the conversations I always had, ate my meals at the kitchen table, and washed up and moved through my days with the modest purposefulness of a man who has largely made his peace with the shape his life has taken. But underneath all of that, something had shifted. I could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before it fully arrives. Not dramatic, not alarming, just present. A different atmospheric pressure in the chest, an altered quality to the silence. I thought about Daniel often, not anxiously. More in the way you think about a conversation that hasn't finished yet, even though the last words have been spoken. We'd spoken on the phone twice in the weeks after the drive, brief calls, nothing of great consequence on the surface. He asked how I was going. I said fine. He mentioned that things at the company were busy. I asked what projects he had running. He said several, and then paused in a way that suggested something he wasn't yet ready to say, and then moved on. I didn't push. I've learned that the things people need to arrive at in their own time should be allowed to arrive in their own time. Pushing doesn't speed that process. It usually just changes its shape into something less genuine. Helen called as well, more than usual actually, 2 or 3 times a week, rather than the weekly call we'd settled into since Margaret died. She didn't mention the dinner directly, and I didn't either. But the increased frequency of contact was itself a kind of statement, and I received it as such. We talked about her work at the pharmacy, about a friend of hers who'd recently been diagnosed with something that required monitoring, about a book she was reading that she thought I'd like. She described it as being about a man who spends his whole life building something that nobody notices, and then one day, the thing he built changes everything. She said she thought of me when she read the description. I said I'd be interested to have a look at it when she was finished. There was a moment in one of those calls, a Wednesday evening, I think, the light outside going that late autumn dark that arrives earlier and earlier as May approaches, where she said, without particular preamble, "Dad, I should have said something. At the dinner, I said, 'It's all right, Helen.' She said, 'It's not really. I knew it wasn't right, and I didn't say anything. And I've been thinking about why I didn't say anything, and I think the honest answer is that I didn't know what to say, because I realized I didn't know enough about what you'd actually done to argue back. And that's my failure, not just that one moment. That's a longer failure.' I sat with that for a moment. I said, 'I should have told you more. That's on me as much as anything.' She said, 'You shouldn't have had to. I should have asked.' We were quiet together for a moment across the phone line, that particular silence between a parent and an adult child who are in the process of seeing each other with more clarity than they previously had. It has a specific texture, a gentleness and a gravity at the same time. I said, 'We'll do better at it from here. Both of us.' She said, 'Yes, that was enough. That was, I think, exactly enough.' Daniel called on a Thursday morning in late May, about 6 weeks after the drive. I was in the workshop when the phone rang, and I came inside with sawdust on my forearms in exactly the way my father used to come inside with grease on his. And I answered it standing at the kitchen window looking out at the lemon tree, which had new growth on it, small pale green shoots at the tips of the branches, the tree's annual assertion that it intended to continue. Daniel said he wanted to come over that afternoon, if that suited me. He said he had something he wanted to bring. I said yes, come for tea. He arrived at 3:30, which is the right time for tea in the middle of a working week, late enough that the day has some substance behind it, early enough that the evening hasn't begun. He was wearing work clothes this time, the practical kind with paint and plaster dust at the knees and cuffs, which meant he'd come directly from a site. There was something more relaxed in how he carried himself than I'd seen in either the veranda encounter, or the kitchen table conversation, or the day of the drive, something that had found a more comfortable position in itself. He was carrying something under his arm, wrapped loosely in a cotton drop cloth, the kind used on painting sites, pale, splattered, folded around something roughly rectangular. He didn't make ceremony of it in the doorway. He just said hello and came inside and put it against the kitchen wall and sat down at the table, and I put the kettle on and got out the ceramic mugs without asking, and we had tea first. He told me what had been happening at the company since the drive. It had started, he said, the night of the day we'd visited the Bridges, with a phone call to his project manager. He'd been thinking since Pyramid Hill, since Cheryl in the cafe had said the bridge is there, you'd be lost without it. About the way his company named its completed developments. He'd been thinking about the names on buildings and what those names said about what the buildings were for and who they served. Names chosen for investors, for marketing, for brand sensibility, names that looked outward, at markets, at profiles, at how something would be perceived, rather than inward at what the thing actually was and what it owed to the people whose knowledge and labor had made it possible. He said, I called Marcus, his project manager, and I told him I wanted to change something, that from the next project completion onward, we were going to name developments differently. Not after investors or geographic features or brand concepts, after the tradespeople and engineers and surveyors who'd built them. I put down my mug. He said, "Not in a showy way. Not plaques on the front facade or names in the signage that the marketing department chose. Something smaller, something more," he searched for the word, "more considered. A name in the architectural drawings, a record kept in the company archive that documented who had done what on every project, properly, with real detail. A quiet acknowledgement that the building had a human history, and that human history mattered." He said the project manager had gone quiet on the phone for about 10 seconds and then said, "That's going to require some structural changes to how we document work." Daniel said, "Good." I sat across the table from him and thought about what it means when an idea planted in one person takes root and begins to grow into something that person makes their own. That's different from influence. That's something more like transmission. The passing of a way of seeing from one person to another, where the receiving person doesn't copy what they've been shown, but translates it into the terms of their own life and work. I said, "What did the team think?" He said, "Some of them thought it was unusual. A few thought it was unnecessary, that it added process without adding commercial value. But one of his senior carpenters, a man named Phil Dowd, who'd been in the trade for 32 years, had heard about it through the project manager and had come to Daniel's office directly to say that it was the best idea he'd encountered in his professional life. He said Phil Dowd had stood in his office doorway and said, 'In 32 years, nobody has ever put my name on anything I've built. Not once.' And Daniel had said, 'That's going to change.' I thought about Phil Dowd. I thought about the specific dignity of a man who has spent 32 years building things with his hands and being entirely invisible within them. I thought about how many Phil Dowds there were in every trade, in every construction company, in every region of the country, people who carried the actual knowledge of how to make things and transferred that knowledge into material structures that outlasted them without ever leaving a trace that could be found. I said, "That's a good thing you're doing, Daniel." He said, "I learned it from you, even if you never intended to teach it." Subscribe to this channel right now if you haven't already, because what I'm about to tell you next is the part of this story I have the hardest time telling without my voice going somewhere I can't always manage. This is the part that changed what I understand about the word legacy, and I don't want you to miss what comes after it. He reached over and picked up the wrapped object from where he'd leaned it against the wall. He set it on the table between us. He said, "I want to give you something. Not a certificate, not a plaque, not anything that needs to be hung on a wall. Something more useful than that." I looked at the drop cloth wrapping. The shape was familiar in the way that something can be familiar before you've identified it. A recognition happening below conscious thought, in the part of you that knows things through accumulated experience rather than deliberate attention. He unwrapped it. It was the chair from Helen's dining room. The chair I'd been sitting in when the dinner conversation had turned, when Daniel had looked across the table and said what he'd said. It was an older piece, colonial revival style, solid blackwood, the kind of furniture that was built in the 1920s with a seriousness of construction that the mass production era didn't bother to replicate. Helen had had it since she and Daniel moved into the Barnard Street house. It had been restored, not in a way that erased the evidence of its age. That would have been wrong, and the man sitting across from me had learned enough in recent weeks to understand that. It had been restored in the way that good restoration works, with respect for what the object actually was, bringing back its integrity without pretending it was new. The blackwood had been properly cleaned and treated, the surface glowing with the particular depth that old timber develops over decades of absorbing light. The joints had been tightened. The seat had been reupholstered in a fabric that was period appropriate, a dark wool blend, sober and correct. The work was careful, more than careful. It was the work of someone who had paid genuine attention, and on the underside of the seat, in a place you would only see if you turned the chair over and looked deliberately, not hidden, not secret, but private, there was a small brass plate. inset flush with the wood so it didn't disrupt the structure. The inscription on it was brief. It said, "The strongest foundations are usually the ones nobody notices." I sat looking at it for a long time. I'm not going to pretend I handled that moment with particular composure. I'm 77 years old and I've had enough life behind me to know that dignity doesn't require composure. It requires honesty. And the honest thing is that something moved through me reading those words. Something that had been held in place for a very long time by the specific silence of a man who'd learned early to keep his relationship with his own work private and had never quite found the moment to undo that. I turned the chair right way up. I set it on the kitchen floor. I looked at it standing there in the afternoon light, and I thought about the dinner table and the silence that had followed the sentence, and I thought about the veranda at dawn and the leather document case, and the kitchen table covered in archival documents, and 3 bridges standing in their particular places across central Victoria, doing what they'd been built to do for 40-odd years, without anyone needing to think about it. I thought about Les Partridge saying a bridge is a promise. I thought about Margaret calling it accountable silence, and whether there had been a version of it that was less about principle and more about a kind of loneliness, and whether the distinction still mattered now, and decided that perhaps the question had answered itself through the events of the past weeks in a way that made it less urgent than it had seemed. I said, "You did this yourself, the restoration." He said, "I'm not a furniture restorer, but Phil Dowd's brother-in-law is. We worked on it together. I wanted to be involved in it with my hands. That felt important." I nodded. He said, "I want to ask you something, and this is the last thing I want to ask, and then I'll go." I said, "Go ahead." He said, at that dinner, did I make you feel like your life didn't matter?" I sat with that question, in the way it deserved to be sat with, not rushing to reassure him, which would have been the easier response and the less honest one, thinking about the actual truth of it, which was more complicated than either yes or no. I said, "You made me feel invisible in a way I wasn't expecting, not because I'd never felt invisible before. I'd felt invisible my whole career, and mostly chosen it. But because at 77, sitting at your daughter's table, you want to feel that the people who know you also know something of what you've been. Not everything, just something." He said, "I'm sorry. Without qualification, I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are. And I want you to understand that what you've done, the bridges, the company change, this matters more than the apology. Not because the apology doesn't matter. It does. But because you took what you learned and you built something with it. That's the only response to learning something that I've ever been able to respect." He stayed another hour. We talked about the company documentation project and about Phil Dowd, who had apparently become an informal advocate for the naming initiative among the trade staff and was actively contributing to the archive records for past projects. We talked about Helen and about how she and I were doing better at telling each other things. We talked about the heritage restoration contract that had originally brought Daniel to the engineering conference in Ballarat. He'd won the partnership tender, and the first structure on the brief was a bridge. He said that with a particular look. I said, "Is that right?" He said the structural assessment had been completed by an engineering firm in Melbourne who had, in the course of their preliminary research, come across records from the original construction, and that the original engineering records, it turned out, were mine. I looked at him. He said, "Not one of the bridges we visited. A different one. A crossing in the Loddon Valley that I hadn't known to look for when I was researching. One that's on the Heritage Register now, which is what makes it part of this contract. And the structural assessment firm said the original engineering was exceptional, that the design had built-in considerations that weren't standard practice at the time, and that had contributed significantly to the structure's longevity and its eligibility for heritage listing." I said, "The Loddon Valley Crossing." He said, "Near Bridgewater. You know it?" I said, "I know it. I did know it. It was a 1979 job, early in my tenure as chief structural engineer. A narrow river crossing that had presented challenges related to the river's seasonal variability. The Loddon could be a thin ribbon of water in summer and a serious force in winter, and the approach I'd taken accounted for that variability in ways that had required considerable argument to get approved. I hadn't thought about it in years. I hadn't known it was on the Heritage Register. I said, "Heritage listed." He said, "Since 2019. For architectural and engineering significance. Your name is in the registration documentation. Not prominently, but it's there." I stood up from the table and went to the window. The lemon tree, the Grevilleas, the workshop roof, the ordinary yard of an ordinary house on Mackenzie Street in Bendigo, in the late afternoon light of a May day, with the particular quality that late autumn gives to everything, a clarity and a slight melancholy that I've always found more beautiful than spring. I thought, 1979, 46 years ago. And the thing I built then is now considered significant enough to be placed on the Heritage Register. And I found out about it from my son-in-law at my kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon in May. I didn't know whether to laugh or simply stand there being moved by the specific absurdity and rightness of it. I did a bit of both, in the private way that men of a certain age allow themselves such moments, not performed, not explained, just felt and allowed to be. Daniel came and stood beside me at the window. He didn't say anything. He'd understood something important about silence, I think, in the course of these weeks. That it wasn't always the absence of communication, that sometimes it was the most precise form of it. After a while I said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" He said, "What?" I said, "Cheryl in the cafe at Pyramid Hill. Bridge is there, you'd be lost without it." She had no idea she was describing the product of 3 weeks of calculation, and a Sunday morning phone call and a soil problem nobody saw coming. She was just describing the landscape she lives in, and that's actually the best possible outcome. That's what it was supposed to be. He said, "I understand that now. I genuinely do." I believe he did. When he left, I carried the restored chair through to the sitting room and placed it near the window that looks out toward the street. Not at the head of the table, not in any symbolic position, just in the corner where the afternoon light comes in at the right angle, and there's a small table beside it that suits a book and a cup of tea. A useful position, a position for living in. I sat in it. The restoration was good. The seat was firm but not rigid, the fabric warm under my hands, the blackwood back solid without being heavy. It had been brought back to what it was meant to be, not disguised as something new, not sentimentalized into something decorative, but functional and honest and built to last. I sat in it and looked out the window at Mackenzie Street in the late afternoon. A man I knew from the neighborhood walked past with the purposeful stride of someone whose route was entirely familiar, looking neither left nor right, entirely at home in his own geography. A car went past slowly, a couple returning from somewhere, the passenger looking out the window at the houses in the way you look at things you see every day and usually don't see. The street was doing what it always did, sustaining the ordinary life of people who depended on it, without requiring them to think about why it was there. Outside, somewhere beyond the visible end of Mackenzie Street, the roads of this city connected to other roads, and those roads eventually reached the country roads I'd driven with Daniel 6 weeks earlier, and those country roads crossed rivers on bridges that had been standing since before some of the people using them were born, carrying their daily purposes, the farmer and his tractor, the delivery driver, the couple on an afternoon drive, the woman pausing to look at water, without any of those people needing to know why the crossing held firm, or who had decided that it should hold firm not just for the next 10 years, but for the next 50. It held because someone had decided the promise was worth keeping properly. That's the thing I want you to take from all of this. And I mean you, the person watching this right now, wherever you are, whatever you've built, or are in the process of building, or are wondering if you'll ever find the courage to build. I spent most of my professional life believing that working in silence was its own reward, that the absence of recognition was a form of integrity, and I still believe there's truth in that, real truth, not just the self-consoling kind. The moment you start building things primarily to be seen doing it, something essential changes in the decisions you make. The person you're building for changes, and that matters in ways that only become visible much later. But I also spent too long confusing that principle with something else, with a kind of distance from my own life that had dressed itself up in the language of humility, but was perhaps, if I'm being honest with myself in the way that Margaret could always make me be, closer to fear. Fear of claiming something. Fear of saying, this is what I did, and it mattered, and I'm not ashamed of saying so. What Daniel gave me, not just the chair, not just the documents, not just the drive across those country roads, was the chance to see my own work from the outside. After 41 years and 12 years of retirement, and 77 years of a life lived largely in my own head, someone finally held up a mirror and said, look, actually look, and what I saw wasn't what I'd expected. I'd expected to see the invisible, the uncredited, the forgotten. What I saw instead was the enduring, and those are not the same thing at all. The evening I sat in that restored chair for the first time, the sun went down slowly over Bendigo, and the light on Mackenzie Street went through the sequence I've watched from one window or another of this house for 50 years, gold to amber, to the deep blue of early evening, and then the streetlights coming on one by one with that slight flicker that old streetlights have before they settle. The neighbors came home from wherever they'd been. Lights came on in windows. The ordinary machinery of an ordinary evening in an ordinary street in a regional city in Victoria, doing what it has always done and will continue doing long after I'm not here to watch it. And somewhere out there, on a road I know the feel of from the wheel of a government Land Rover in the 1970s, over a river that has its own seasonal logic, in a landscape that still speaks the language Les Partridge taught me to listen for, a bridge was doing what it had always done, not because anyone was watching, not because my name was anywhere visible on its surface, but because someone had made a careful promise a long time ago, and the concrete, and the steel, and the modified foundation, and the extra clearance for the 100-year flood had been holding that promise quietly, ever since, day after ordinary day, for everyone who crossed it without needing to know it, had been made. That's enough. It has always been enough. I just needed 77 years and a careless sentence at a Sunday dinner table to fully understand it. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, and I mean truly stayed, not just let it play while you were doing something else, but actually listened, then you understand something now that I think is worth carrying, about what it means to build something, about what it means to last, about the difference between being remembered and being relied upon. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Leave a comment below. Tell me about something in your own life that has lasted quietly, something you made or someone made for you that kept its promise without asking for recognition. I want to know. I genuinely want to know, because those stories exist in every life, and they almost never get told, and they should be told. And if you know someone who builds things quietly, with their hands, with their mind, with 40 years of showing up and doing the work without needing the world to applaud them for it, share this with them. Because the strongest foundations are usually the ones nobody notices, until they do.